and integrity. But my previous role was I was a PGR strategy and policy manager. And I changed roles in 2023, but that role still sits in my team. Kieran is here today. She occupies that role and leads that team. I completed a doctorate in education in 2024. I started in 2015, so it was a really long journey, but I was rudely interrupted by a global pandemic. And I took a couple of years off in the middle, essentially to make sure that our PGRs were getting the funding that they needed from the resources we had in the institution. And I want to highlight that this is a professional doctorate. So it's different from a PhD, but it is an equivalent qualification at a doctoral level. And it's assessed by a monograph style thesis, making an original contribution to knowledge, and examined by a viva voce. So it is fully equivalent. And as our own website says, it focuses on that interrelationship of research policy and practice. So I'm examining my own working practice, and I'm looking to how can I make changes in my own environment through this research that I've done. And if it'll let me change slides. So what do I mean everyone wants to be a graduate school? So what I'm talking about here is the way we deliver and structure researcher education or doctoral education. We have a very complex setting in the university, subjects, labs, schools, colleges, and we exist in an even more complex cross-institutional setting with doctoral training partnerships, CDTs, research pools, various communities, and of course, Scottish graduate schools. So I've observed that we put a lot of structure around doctoral education in an attempt to provide more support and improve outcomes. We assume that this is the best thing to do. And a lot of these structures call themselves graduate schools, whether in colleges or schools or in these cross-institutional entities. So the observations from this work apply specifically to my thinking about the Scottish graduate schools, but how I answered the research questions, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also broadly about how we structure and support researcher education. So many of you will observe there have been a number of structural changes to doctoral education over recent years. The increase in training and development opportunities, whether that's focused on methods or skills or careers, structured models of delivery, which vary from cohorts like centers for doctoral training, structured support by graduate schools and doctoral colleges. Glasgow is actually quite a rare institution in the sense that we don't have a central entity beyond the PGR policy team and colleagues in research culture and researcher development who deliver some of those things centrally. And these cross-institutional funding models, which have become very popular, and UKRI relies quite heavily on them. The Scottish graduate schools and the emergence of these increasingly structured entities for doctoral education has been a feature of my role in that period from 2007 and until now. The first SGSSS Doctoral Training Center went live in 2011, and I think this is our fourth iteration. I think we renewed the Doctoral Training Center, we had a doctoral training partnership, and now we're on DTP2, and it's changed every time. It's continued to evolve. And then the SGSAH, the Scottish Graduate School for the Arts and Humanities, was formed a couple of years behind the SGSSS, having learned some lessons from their initial struggles to form such a large cross-institutional entity. So having had the opportunity to observe these entities and how they were created and the impacts, it seemed reasonable to interrogate their value, as we've tended to assume that more money is a great thing and that's the end of the story. And I want to say, and I'll probably say this half a dozen times, nothing is necessarily all negative or all positive. I don't want to say that anything that happens here, anything that's changed in the landscape is necessarily negative or necessarily positive. But I am suggesting that actually we're not always interrogating what's negative and what's positive about these changes as they're happening. So why did I start thinking about this? Doing an EdD, you do go through a process of several talk courses where you're engaging with the literature in various ways, whether that's policy or around futures thinking or around how your particular corner of the educational landscape is structured. And as I was starting to look into this, I know how much we measure things in the institution because I'm involved in measuring them, whether that's income or publications, outputs, time to completion, which is always an exciting thing to talk about. I wanted to look past that. How do PGRs actually experience this environment? What's meaningful to them? And do these organizational structures that are very, very important to us, do they matter to students? And one of the things I relied on, and you'll note because I was doing my EdD for such a long time, some of this literature is a decade old. The literature landscape has mushroomed quite a bit in the past decade as well, but I'm relying on what I was using when I was actually doing this work. So Nick Hopwood took a socio-cultural view of doctoral students' relationships and agency. And he suggests that we need to account for a wide range of relationships in our understanding of doctoral learning and experience, situate those relationships in time and space, and understand them in relation to students as intentional, agentic beings with the capacity to shape their own experience. So he's suggesting that we think about the people, not the structures. That same year, he published another article, also with that sociocultural perspective. And he was thinking that students' engagement in formative practices can be understood with respect to their personal intentions, so that agency, what they're bringing to the table, what they're bringing to their experience. And that this is the flip side of the dominant policy perspective, which emphasizes the outputs of doctoral education. And the study demonstrates the crucial role of emergent and unstructured experiences in doctoral students' learning, alongside the more formal aspects. So this is what I was thinking about when I was formulating research questions and looking at the Scottish graduate schools. So from the perspective of students, how do these UKRI-funded Scottish graduate schools contribute to doctoral learning and development? Does participation add value to the student experience? And what do students think that value is? So to do that, I interviewed a group of students. There were 9 students in all from across the SGSSS and SGSAH, a mixture of full and part-time students. They all were in what they were calling their 3rd year of study, but because some of them were part-time students, they weren't in exactly the same place in their programs. But they reflected demographically what you would expect the population to look like in these entities at that time. I asked them, I did an ice-breaking exercise with them to ask them to model their support networks. In the face-to-face interviews pre-pandemic, we used index cards on a table. During the online interviews during the pandemic and towards the end, I was using Padlet and it was virtual sticky notes, but just asking them to think about what was meaningful to their experience, who helped them and what helped them. So it was people as well as organizational entities and things on the sticky notes. And I asked them to think about what their expectations were, what their motivations were those met, what's helped them to progress, what's hindered them, what's been surprising, what's been positive, what's been negative. Essentially just to tell me about their experience and about what's helped them in that experience and what's been problematic for them. And then I specifically dug into what are the positive and negative aspects about being part of a doctoral training structure like the Scottish Graduate School. And was that experience relevant? How did they think about it? And what kind of things did they participate in as being part of one of these larger doctoral training entities? Just briefly, my analysis, I was taking an interpretivist view, so that, that multiple viewpoints and lenses are possible and that meaning is possible at both individual and group levels. I started thinking about interpretive phenomenological analysis, but that would have limited me in terms of the number of interviews I could take, and is a very, very detailed method for analyzing the text of an interview or something similar. And so I moved more towards a descriptive phenomenology. And I think this helped me to focus on specific things and emphasizing openness, questioning pre-understanding, and adopting a reflective attitude. That was important for me in this work as an insider researcher, as a staff member at the institution and a student at the institution, asking students at that same institution about their experiences. I needed to be very careful and remain reflective about what I was bringing to the table in terms of my preconceptions and what I was hearing from students, and make sure that I wasn't just hearing what I wanted to hear. So their view is that lived experience is illuminated through this kind of thematic analysis, and ultimately that's what I did. A pretty standard thematic analysis. I was drawing on Braun and Clark, and I used in vivo to analyze my data. But before I go back to the data, excuse me, to situate this in the literature, I was thinking about what is learning and what different approaches are there to learning. And effectively, very, very simply, because there's a lot of controversy about what your position is and what you think learning is, but learning sometimes is seen as inside the brain in a cognitive structure or an internal representation of knowledge inside an individual's head, or completely outside a person as the participation in their environment, or as a middle ground that actually puts individual and social interaction with the world together. And I prefer that personally, that third interpretation, where we're not taking the individual out of the equation, but we cannot deny the experience of individuals in a social world. And it would be difficult to talk about socially oriented theories of learning without talking about Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger's ideas about communities of practice. And they wrote a book about situated learning in 1991. That's, whether you agree with it or not, considered a seminal work in this space. And they offered the following definition of a community of practice: a set of relations among persons' activity in the world over time and in relation with other tangential and overlapping communities of practice, an intrinsic condition for the existence of knowledge as it provides the interpretive support necessary for making sense of its heritage. Participation in the cultural practice in which any knowledge exists is an epistemological principle of learning. The social structure of this practice, its power relations, and its conditions for legitimacy define the possibilities for learning. They specifically mention legitimate peripheral participation. I'm not going to go on about that. That was the subtitle of that 1991 work, and that simply refers to people entering communities as a novice at the periphery and moving to the figurative center of a community. And they talked a lot about that in that work. So Wenger stresses in some later work that the concept of communities of practice is a shorthand to describe his broader theory of learning as social participation. And he talks about meaning, practice, community, and identity. And he equates meaning with experience, doing with practice, community with belonging, and identity with becoming. And I've adopted those components throughout this piece of work. And he describes it as a perspective that locates learning not in the head or outside of it, but in the relationship between person and the world, and that the social world is a resource for constituting one's identity. So you're focusing on the person as well as the social interaction. And actually, even in that 1991 work where they refer to communities of practice as over time and in relation with other tangential and overlapping communities of practice, they set up some later work, Wenger Trainer et al. In 2015, where they wrote a book about learning in landscapes of practice. And just to explain the name change, Etienne Wenger married a lady called Beverly Trainer, and they both adopted the name Wenger Trainer. So you see some of the literature later referred to as Wenger Trainer and Wenger Trainer as they worked together. But it is the same person, Etienne Wenger. So this idea of a landscape of practice reflects the complexity of the social world that individuals inhabit. It's a useful metaphor, I found, this was my perspective, for the doctoral learning journey, as it allowed for description of the complex relationships and activities of the doctoral student experience, and it helped me to conceptualize a learning trajectory for students through a program across and through this landscape as they progress. And viewing this as a landscape, for example, the size and scale of the SGSs make it challenging to conceive of them as cohorts. They originally used that language quite a bit in describing themselves, but because of their size, their cross-institutional structure, and their multidisciplinary ranges, it's difficult to see them as cohorts where they have a sameness to them. Students in these funding streams are not tightly linked to other students. They follow broadly similar journeys through doctoral programs in broadly related fields. They associate with each other through training and events, many of which are optional, but fundamentally they're loosely connected to one another within their institutions and within these entities. They each have their own connections and communities, and this suggests a bigger picture of interactivity and relatedness, as well as how that varies from person to person. Now, I was encouraged by my supervisor to visualize this, and I will admit that that's not my strong skill, visualizing things. I'm much better at the words, and you might guess that from the way my slides are constructed. I like telling you the story about the words. But I did model this in a very simple way to try and see what this landscape looked like. So contrasting the individual experience with the structural factors and using meaning, experience, practice, doing, community, belonging, and learning and identity. And this is what I came up with. It's very simple. Training and development sits at the center of it because that's the crux of the learning experience. This should be seen as doctoral training writ large, the way we refer to doctoral training partnerships and doctoral training rather than something quite specific. And this helped me to try and just see where I was heading with some of these ideas and what a landscape actually looks like. And I'll come back to this diagram a bit later because I've added some things to it as I've thought through the results of the research. And in looking at the detail of what was provided in the interviews, two really strong themes came out: community and connection and complexity and bureaucracy. They came out really strongly. It was quite undeniable. All of the students spoke about things that fit into these themes and sub-themes. And under community and connection, excuse me, we talked about shared workspaces and shared experiences. And in complexity and bureaucracy, we talked about student experience and the training landscape. And again, the training landscape should be seen in a broad sense. And a lot of times what they were talking about was the methodological training that is provided largely through the Scottish graduate schools from their perspective, as that was in part what I was asking them about. So shared workspaces can be offices, disciplinary campus spaces, and different non-disciplinary workspaces that were shared in some way. I was doing these interviews before there were so many hot desking spaces on campus, so it'd be really interesting to see how that's reflected in students now, because I see students, for example, in the ARC, in the hot desking spaces, and how they're using them, and I do wonder what that adds to their experience, but that's maybe a question for later research if I retire and want to take this forward. So what did they actually say? I've got a few slides with just some of the quotes from the interviews. And students noted it's kind of lonely initially, but my peers have been helping me along. You're going through the same things together, and that's really good. A student with really appreciated having an office space, feeling like I have a community and to be able to speak to people and ask casual questions. They wouldn't change anything about their own experience, but I would change it so that everybody else gets that. It was that important to them. I definitely feel more involved in this community around the subject than the Scottish Graduate School, but not that you wouldn't expect that. It's not necessarily a negative thing. They saw the place of the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities, and it didn't take away from their experience locally in that case. And a comment that you can turn around and talk to people about a paper, about what the annual progress review involves, standing in the kitchen, talking to academic colleagues. You pick things up, useful stuff that you can just sort of absorb. Now, in terms of shared experiences, the Scottish graduate schools don't provide office spaces. They don't provide that kind of local connection. That's absolutely not their role, and they've not tried to do that. And I would say that in talking about these experiences, students discuss them less than the value of those shared workplaces and that day-to-day experience. But as I was specifically asking them about this, they were responding about it. And there are some contrasting comments here. So it suggests that the cohort type approach taken by large entities is not uniformly positive for participants, and it's not experienced in the same way by all participants. And even within individual journeys, experience and expectations can vary. And there's a difference between appreciating aspects of the experience and feeling connected to the group that's part of one's own community. And a few more quotes. A student who went on a 2-day event said everyone was very friendly. We went to the pub afterwards. There would be socializing. Even though it was the only one I've been to where it was quite subject specific, that wasn't the reason why I enjoyed it so much. They really enjoyed that engagement with other students that was organized by the SGSSS. Thomas says they set up a few cohort building exercises, quite fun, quite a good opportunity, gets you meeting other people, interesting colleagues, friends, networking. One of the colleagues says, SGSAH feel like they do actually have a commitment to try and build links between researchers, and in particular as a part-timer, I think it's been really good. Another student says, amusingly, reflecting on attending mandatory training, oh no, I've got to go somewhere and do this thing. But then it's just been overwhelmingly positive, meeting my colleagues again and building these relationships, which is interesting because students don't always like to attend mandatory things when they're told to do so, but when they reflect on them afterwards, they actually think, actually, that was great. Not all experiences that were reflected were positive. One student said she just felt like the SGSSS had really fallen short of what she would have expected in that particular context that she was describing. That was just, that's not necessarily a condemnation of all of SGSSS, but just a comment about a particular experience. And another student said, do I feel any kind of belonging or membership with this wider cohort other than the Friday email update? I don't really, to be honest, and that there's potential for that aspect to be a bit stronger. Complexity and bureaucracy is something that was discussed throughout. When asked students what the challenges were, it was almost always related to something that could be described as complexity or bureaucracy, all the ways that they struggled to work through processes or work through requirements or understand what they wanted to do. And I think it's important to note that not any one layer of the institution or extra institutional activity is consistently problematic. The problem is the number of layers that students have to work through and how this results in confusion and overlapping requirements. But I think it's also important to note that complexity brings variety and opportunity. It's not inherently negative. And what participants see as negative is as much how the complexity is or isn't managed, more so than the actual complexity itself. They love having lots of things to choose from. They just struggle with how to work through that process. And some student comments about this. The main thing was the process, which is so slow. It was a student who wanted to change supervisor. That's maybe more of a reflection of an institutional experience, but they did actually wonder, should SGSSS have a role in that, for example? And another student, and similar to their comment on a previous slide, I do feel pretty let down by how little support there was for me. I wasn't expecting that. A student recounting an experience. I ended up in a position where I was doing my PhD full-time, doing full-time teaching, and then doing 2 modules, which was a lot. That was my nightmare year. And they did ask the SGSSS if they could do things differently, and were told no, they needed to meet the requirements in a specific way, and they just had to get on with it. But it reflects the tension between the different entities, the university and the SGSSS, each having their own requirements. They ended up in conflict. Neither one necessarily saw a way to be flexible about that. She also says, you're part of a big machine. You don't have like your key worker, like a contact that's just for you, that's checking my going on. So she felt she didn't have someone to speak to that could help her kind of work through this. I think broadly speaking, probably SGSSS meet what they're aiming to do quite well. It's just quite confusing at times, trying to work out what's supposed to happen where. So perhaps there's a broader point there about how everything fits together. And my summary of that is that students are often unclear about how to explore their options or what those options are. They might talk to staff. Every member of staff at the university is very busy. We don't always have the flexibility to say it's fine to do something different or a way to help them through that situation. And I think it's important to understand that while students might benefit from more individualized support, the number of students that we have makes that very difficult. We have 4,000 plus PGRs, so having an individualized experience and support system designed by the university or by another entity is pretty much impossible. So I think we have to think of everything I'm saying here in that context. And just a comment about supervisors. The student said she didn't have a key worker. Well, in effect, she did. She had a supervisor. But I think the supervisors work in the same landscape that professional service staff work in. So supervisors don't always have all the answers. They don't always have the capacity or the ability to make the changes or to change things for students, or even access or understanding of the bureaucratic landscape that students exist in. So supervisors need help too. And it just reflects the complexity and the challenges in the landscape. Speaking specifically about training, all students talked about this. They spoke a lot about the complexity of this and the repetitiveness in what they, from their perspective, saw as being asked to take training by a number of different entities. And again, unless specifically noted, in this case, training is largely about the kind of research methods training, which they were very focused on. And how they felt about some of those experiences varied. Some were frustrated, but some just acknowledged it's part of the experience of a complex landscape, and they valued what they were receiving in terms of their training and development, despite the challenges that they faced. Some reported significant benefits to the training in either providing social or community support, or in the kinds of learning about things, about their research and about methods that actually transform their thinking about what they were doing. One student said, it was just a tick the box exercise. I had to do it. It seems a bit disjointed. I'm not really sure what I'm expected to do this year. Another said, you end up doing the same thing 10 different times, having the same conversation 10 different times. There's a question about the appropriate scale at which these things happen, maybe. Another says, a lot of what I've done is self-taught. Courses offered by SGSSS might be more appropriate, or ones offered by the College of Social Sciences. I'm not kept in the loop about that. I think there's an interesting point there, because that student was in the College of Arts and Humanities, funded by the SGSAH, but they felt that in their particular project, in space that they were working in, there was a lot of overlap between social sciences and the arts and humanities, but they struggled to actually engage with things across that organizational, institutional boundary. Another says, to be honest, the main things I accessed in terms of training, networking, things like that has been through a research center. So while they were getting the training they needed, they were focused on a different entity. They found that the research center they sat in was providing most of what they needed. Another said, I felt a lot of the training was geared toward individuals who hadn't been out in the working world, but actually most of them that I was meeting had, so it wasn't quite matching up. I thought that was a really interesting comment. And again, if I could retire and spend time unpicking bits of this research, I would come back to that as well, because that's my experience as a mature student. A lot of the training that would have been available to me as a PGR probably wasn't that helpful in some ways, because I've been at this for a few decades, so I come with quite a lot of training already under my belt. So the kinds of development that I might find most useful weren't necessarily what's offered in this menu that's meant to actually serve a large number of students with quite a lot of diversity in the population. So trying to make sense of that, there's a lot of interconnected and opposing forces. Structures, rules, and formal programming of events and activities support the learning journey, but can complicate it and or erode its individual nature through this kind of enforced participation that we insist on sometimes. In contrast to the articulated value or need for community and social support, doctoral study is often seen as and experienced as an individual journey, but this sits in contrast to a push to standardize offerings and create more structure, presumably with a view to greater efficiency and swifter journeys through the programs. We're all accountable for our completion rates. The tendency to continue to add more formal structures to the doctoral journey seems to conflict with this individualized journey. So it's difficult to see how to reconcile that easily. There's a suggestion in the interview data that you get out what you put in to a certain extent. If you are willing to engage with the opportunities available to you, you will find benefits. And this reflects the agentic nature of the learning journey, the choices that students make about what they need to do for their own projects and to develop themselves to meet the goals that they have about their own lives. The complexity of the landscapes in which these opportunities or programs are delivered adds challenge and frustration. Sometimes there's a lack of clarity. Students don't always have clear expectations. Sometimes we assume, all of us in our different roles in the landscape, assume that students know things that they don't. The level at which opportunities are offered, as well as a lack of flexibility, can add some negative components to what's broadly felt to be a positive experience. I didn't come away from any of the interviews with students thinking, gosh, that person's having a terrible time. But I had to acknowledge the challenges that they faced. In trying to make sense of this, I saw these as challenges and opportunities, but that there were opportunities within the challenges and challenges within the opportunities. And that reflects that nothing is wholly negative or wholly positive about the experience. It's just about how we choose to understand it. So within complexity and bureaucracy, the opportunities are to create more flexibility and more agency for students, the way that they go about making choices and the way that they're able to address their own needs. And in the opportunities that exist for building community and for those social networks, there are challenges. There's a need for sustained engagement with other people. These sort of one-off interactions can be quite beneficial, but they don't provide that community. They don't provide that sustained learning, that ongoing dialogue or conversation. And there's obviously a challenge with communities as well, in that they can become exclusive. Just because you want to be part of the community doesn't mean that you're welcomed into it. And it does point out that communities are full of humans and that interpersonal relationships can be quite challenging. So embedded within opportunities are challenges, and within challenges are opportunities. But to step back from that, I found it helpful to think about this, because there is so much interconnection and so many different forces at play, is how could we see a bigger picture? And that bigger picture for me was to think about a landscape of practice. Storberg and Walker talk about communities of practice and being one way for limited human minds to structure complicated multi-level social phenomena and to look at collective learning processes, interpret social relations, and identify how these affect learning and identity development. And that really spoke to me. And maybe that's just my limited human mind, but how do I try to understand this very complicated thing that students have been sharing with me? So extending this view to a landscape of practice, a landscape of communities that are interwoven together, helps to frame this complex experience. And Wenger says that when he sees this view of a landscape, it's defined by practice, not institutional affiliation, and those communities. So those communities exist based on what students interact with, not what we tell them. They don't necessarily care that they're part of a school or a college or a university, other than the quite instrumental ways that those help them. But what they think about day to day are their communities, and they're thinking about the people. Wenger sees an important aspect of an individual's identity and to their learning as linked to this multi-membership, this membership in lots of different communities and into a variety of communities. And this multi-membership is an important way that practice is shared across different communities. By learning in one space and moving into other spaces, you're sharing that, and there's a synergistic effect across the whole landscape. And Wenger says that the very notion of identity entails an experience of multi-membership and the work of reconciliation necessary to maintain one identity across boundaries. And apologies if not everyone is embedded in the kind of educational literature that I've drawn on here, but identity development and learning are seen as very closely linked. You become someone else as you learn. And we talk a lot about doctoral education about becoming a researcher. So that's a very important aspect of becoming, although not everyone sees their journey as becoming a researcher. That's a personal choice. But this idea that you belong in all these different communities and in communities that you've chosen, and how those communities affect you and how you affect them in return is key to this thinking. So learners are active participants in these communities in constructing their identities in relation to these communities, as well as supporting learning as experience, doing, belonging, and becoming. The active participation considered by Wenger Trainer and Wenger Trainer is a trajectory, becoming a person who inhabits the landscape with an identity whose dynamic construction reflects our trajectory through that landscape. And in that same collected work, which was edited by Wenger Trainer and others, Fenton O'Creevy says that there are multiple trajectories across the landscape. Not every trajectory is the same. The landscape doesn't look the same to everyone. The levels of engagement, participation, or embeddedness within a community can be different for different individuals at different times. So that single journey changes the whole time, and everyone else is on that single journey. This underscores the dynamic nature of the journey, although, as I describe it, it really sounds quite chaotic. And I think sometimes that's the experience that students have, is that we're not always helping them to make sense of it. And I think for ourselves, we don't always have that understanding of it ourselves. We're trying to manage that chaos in our day-to-day lives. So I've updated the figure, having thought through all of that as I came back to an analysis and a discussion of the data from the interviews. I've updated it, not a lot, I'll show you in a second, but I wanted to bring that dynamism in, and I wanted to focus on, in particular, meaning and practice, and where that meaning making that individuals do and the practices within people engage, and the relational interdependence, which I think is an important concept, that you act on your world and your world acts on you, and that's a constant flow of relations, and the individuals chart their own trajectories through this journey. So I've tried to make this updated doctoral learning landscape more dynamic to show that this is constantly in motion. It still sits with training and development at the center. I'm happy to take arguments about why that could have been constructed differently, but this is, in terms of what I was trying to articulate in my thesis, this is what was useful to me to reflect a view of the landscape. And it reflects that individual, personal, community aspect on one axis, and on an opposing axis, the sort of structural elements. But everything fits together, and everything does feed into that learning journey and that training and development that sit at the center of it. So maybe what you've been waiting to hear is, did I answer the questions? What did I actually find in all of this? So again, neither the opportunities nor the challenges are wholly negative or positive, as they, challenges have opportunities and vice versa. But the values found in the variety and dynamism of the landscape, and through the significant contributions to training and development that are orchestrated by entities like the Scottish graduate schools, in this case, in this research, specifically the Scottish graduate schools. The size of the operations and the critical mass created enable opportunity on a scale that individual institutions generally can't replicate. And I think thinking about the Scottish graduate schools as Scottish national entities, I think that's really important, because it's not just about Glasgow. This research was, in that I spoke only to Glasgow students, but how that entity operates across a landscape of institutions of different sizes, I think shouldn't be underestimated. And our ability to feed into that landscape across much smaller institutions, where the University of the Highlands and Islands or some of our, the Royal Conservatoire, much smaller entities that aren't able to generate that critical mass, and we feed into that. But it's important to understand the nuances. The value of the opportunities is clear. the additional bureaucracy and complexity and the ways that this sometimes supplants local structures and regulations can be unhelpful. And I think that tarnishes the value. And that comes back to the, if you're subject to two things called a graduate school, or in some cases, maybe more things, who are you listening to and how do you work your way through that as a student? The SGS's participation in the doctoral education and landscape has been somewhat unexamined on the unquestioned premise that more funding and more training can only be positive. And it's difficult to refute that kind of statement. Of course, the funding's positive, and of course, they're adding things that are quite positive, but the complexity is very challenging. And we haven't really stopped to think about the whole landscape. So all of this is done in goodwill. We want to provide the best possible service and support, but there's often little coordination, interconnectedness, or accountability between units and entities. So there's a lot of competition and repetition across the landscape. And this is where I get a bit controversial, so forgive me. But there's evidence to suggest that while different levels within each organizational unit may have different views about where they should contribute, this isn't broadly agreed. And this is controversial because of this quote from Bradall and Malloy. At the practice level, our results suggest that universities should work explicitly to define roles and responsibilities. And they specifically recommend something which it runs a bit counter to our existing culture. Graduate faculties rather than departments should take the lead is their suggestion. And basically that local departments should resist the temptation to create things, but rather look to graduate faculties. Now, we don't use words like departments and faculties, and I'm sorry that I use them, but I am reflecting what's in that quote. So you might not agree with the specific perspective they offer, but I think the point is valid, that we should be working to understand our roles and responsibilities and how we fit together. And individual entities shouldn't necessarily replicate what exists elsewhere. If it's already done well, instead of replicating, you could maybe seek to feed into it or add to it in such a way without replicating. And PGRs, as I've said throughout this, they valued people, community, and experience more than those structures and boundaries. And I don't want to suggest that structures and boundaries aren't valued or aren't valuable, but from our perspective institutionally, I think we do tend to overvalue those organizational lines. They give us comfort to sit within those specific organizational boundaries. So how do we find value in all of this? How do we actually enhance that value? And one way to do this is through the idea of being systems conveners. And having seen a lot of you come into the room, I think I'm preaching to the converted in a lot of cases. I would describe a lot of you who are listening to this as systems conveners, even if you haven't chosen those words. But Wenger Trainer and Wenger Trainer describe this role. Conveners see a social landscape with all its separate and related practices through a wide-angle lens. They spot opportunities for creating new learning spaces and partnerships that will bring different and often unlikely people together to engage in learning across boundaries. And they note that tools help, but cannot replace the credibility and personal relationships developed through common work. What do? They sensing, brokering, modeling, coaching, designing, reflecting, all the things that lots of people here do. Wenger Trainer and Wenger Trainer see this role as enabling change and collaboration, creating new capabilities, and spotting and acting on potential in the landscape. And by drawing attention to this concept, what I'm suggesting in part is that we don't necessarily do this explicitly. Some of us do this by the very nature of how we work, but I think an explicit focus on this has the potential to release some of the repetition and energy in the system that's maybe used poorly. So conveners don't come in expecting to change things necessarily. They honor the existing accountability of stakeholders. So it's not about coming in and say, look, I'm just going to tell you how to do this better because you've not got it right. It's about working with people. And it's about inviting people, as they say here, to reconfigure their identity to become part of a reconfigured landscape. But it's inviting people into that project of taking a holistic view. So what we've observed in this work is that largely things are done to students and for students. It's very top down sometimes. And what can be missing institutionally is that meaningful holistic view and an acknowledgement value of student experience and student agency. And this project looked very much at student experience and student agency, but I would argue that this same thing could be said about staff and all the staff who support students in different ways, whether through more senior academic roles or through the work of the day-to-day supervision of students. But we don't always see that holistic view. And that's a challenging thing to do because we're all very busy. But explicitly acting as system conveners could bring that holistic view in, that view of the whole system, and to actually bring in how people think about their experiences. And I suggest this is something that Scottish graduate schools or others in similar positions could do, and make sure that they're enabling specific colleagues to undertake this work and explicitly articulate the enabling functions that they're providing. And as I said before, the Scottish graduate schools have superimposed themselves on this landscape with our very willing participation. We've been very grateful for the money they've provided and the critical mass they've provided, but we haven't necessarily thought about how they fit in. We've just kind of had to like budge up and make room for them. And we haven't really thought about the negative and positive impacts of that. We've just been told, here's the money, here's what you have to do to keep it. And we've tried to do that alongside everything else that we're doing. So this systems convener view could take that wide angle lens and could release energy and resources from repetitive efforts across the landscape and direct it more productively. And there's lots of ways to do that. And I would welcome some discussion about quite specific tools or approaches to systems convening in the landscape, the way that students might engage with knowledge or practice through development, the ways that communities and peer support could be fostered more effectively, or the ways that we can make the environment one such that these communities emerge on their own, that students are empowered and enabled to build their own spaces. It's not about providing those things for them, but it's making sure that the environment that they exist in actually enables that. And to encourage students to understand their personal journeys and personal journeys of transformation. So implications, there's tensions between individual needs and one-size-fits-all solutions. We sometimes view students as stakeholders or customers rather than agentic co-creators. They benefit from access to this dynamic landscape of possibilities, peers, and communities, but they need to in turn be engaged with that. So how do we help them do that, and how do we foster that engagement? How do we make sure that they understand that engagement is needed? Institutions, DTPs, and funders are under pressure to meet a broad range of student needs, support larger numbers, deliver on metrics, and different kinds of agenda. So this leads to a focus on streamlining. I have 100 things to do. Could I come up with 5 ways to do all of them? And can I just build stuff? If you build it, they will come. Although I think we've all seen evidence that that's absolutely not the case with PGRs. So how do we engage them in that activity rather than just provide stuff and hope that they pick it up and run with it? And are there ways that existing drivers, for example, methods training, could be harnessed to build community rather than just things that we deliver? And I have noticed that over time, the SGSSS in particular has picked up some of those ideas around methods training and is trying to create something that's more holistic and can be used by the whole cohort of the Scottish Graduate School around methods training. But it seems that that's something that students are super concerned about and really focused on, and something they want to talk about and share over. And there could be ways that that's actually used to bring students together in ways that they're supporting each other to learn and understand, and that actually just delivering things to them maybe isn't always the best approach when they can be helping each other through some of these things. Supervisors and supporters, and I include all of us in that, need to have a knowledge and understanding and engagement with the landscape, and we need to help each other do that. It's easy for me to say, oh, supervisors need to get with the program and to know more, but I think myself and my teams, we have a role in helping supervisors to do that, to understand what the institution provides, what those rules are, and how students can work through that. And I think that helps them in their own professional development journey as well as supervisors. All actors in the landscape should be helping to foster community and network building, and to communicate clearly and manage expectations so the students know what to expect, and they know what you're going to do or what you can do and what you can't, and maybe where to go for those things. Organizational units are generally inwardly focused rather than on their place in the landscape. So we're all thinking, great, I've heard this great idea, I'm going to go back to the ranch and do that there, as opposed to thinking, how do I engage with this existing opportunity that already exists? And then there are simply some realities. We are handed operational responsibilities and policy initiatives from DTPs and from funders, and sometimes we just don't have a lot of choices in doing that. So my high-level recommendation is that we need to stop and reflect. And how do we focus on the student experience as well as the outcome of that experience? And how do we take a more holistic perspective about our landscape institutionally? And I think in a lot of ways, we need to be willing to stop doing some things, to actually stop and step back and say, actually, someone else is doing that. I don't need to do that, or I don't need to redevelop this whole idea just for my group of students when actually I can connect to something larger. And that's not always going to be, 100% of opportunities aren't going to be suitable for that, but we don't stop and think about that very often. What should I not do? And I think funders have a role in here. Funders should work more closely with us as institutions, as doctoral training partnerships, and others in the sector to address these measures, these policy initiatives, and these reporting requirements so that we can address them as a group. Every institution says, oh gosh, I've got to do EDI now. And 100 different institutions do that 100 different ways, where actually we could probably come together quite productively and do the same thing or a small set of the same things in a much more efficient way if we were able to collaborate and build consensus. So the suggestion there is that funders or doctoral training partners should be taking on roles as systems conveners. And while there's work required to do that, that same work releases energy in the system elsewhere. Funders could maybe stop calling everything graduate schools. We could maybe stop calling everything graduate schools. That's back to the title of this talk. Graduate schools as an idea, it implies certain things. We have college graduate schools. They're formalized as graduate schools, and that's their role. But having other entities with the same name is confusing. The responsibilities overlap, and it's very unclear. Students don't really know, where am I looking for this? Is it my school? Is it my college? Is it my funder? And we maybe need to think about what that terminology means and what we're doing there. We could actually just be explicit about new things that we do. DTPs and HEI leaders who are actually designing these new programs could actually explicitly address that. And it could actually be a requirement that you need to set out how you're not just reinventing everything and how you're adding value to the entire landscape and how you're connecting with things that already exist, rather than just saying, I'm going to build up a whole bunch of new stuff for this very small group of students. Thank you for the money. There's a responsibility, I think, to use that money well and not replicate things that already exist. And funders don't necessarily promote that idea in their own choices about what they fund. And we should be thinking about this internally. We should consider undertaking a evaluative exercise to understand our own roles and responsibilities for PGR delivery. And you'll be really pleased to know that we're doing that. This is the joy of a professional doctorate, as I immediately turned this and thought, what can I do in my own world, in my own team, to try and look at this? So we've been running a project for the past couple of months, the PGR Ecosystem Project. Everyone here will have at some point had invitations to focus groups to talk about this, whether you were able to attend or not. The first set of focus groups, there were half a dozen of them, were done. We've had 2 fantastic interns who've been working on this, and hopefully we'll soon be able to release some of the first sets of analysis from the results of those focus groups, and we'll start looking at what the next steps are. But the explicit point is, what are we doing? Who's doing it? Why are we doing it? What replication is in the system? And how can we be more consistent about what we're doing? So just a couple of slides to finish, I promise. The overriding observation is that, the SGSs, the Scottish graduate schools, have added a lot, have been hugely positive in the landscape. But because they've called themselves graduate schools, this could be seen as a bit unhelpful. And I think it's muddied the water. The tendency of multiple institutional entities to designate themselves as graduate schools. And there are some schools in the university who have their own graduate school, as they've called it. And there are other entities that have graduate schools. And there's lots of positive reasons for people doing this and wanting to support their own students the best they can. But it is confusing. And these things overlap, and it does create confusion for students. The ways in which students felt the Scottish graduate schools most added value was the training and development, the potential for formal and informal interactions across the partnership, and the provision of funding. They all were really very grateful for the funding. That came through very clearly. But all of this could be done without saying we're a graduate school. And that equating of that activity outside the institution as an extra institutional regulatory entity is quite challenging. We could have just had a slightly different model, a model that was focused on collaboration and partnership, which I appreciate is harder to measure, and we do tend towards delivery and control. So that is challenging, and it's hard to report on that, but it is kind of a missed opportunity. A useful question for funders to consider is, in what ways could they be less directive? They do have to measure things. They're given money from government, they're accountable, DTPs are accountable, and that goes on so on down the chain. But how could we do that in a less directive way? What kind of reporting could we put in place where we were thinking more creatively about the kinds of stories we told about doctoral education, other than 70% of our students completed on time, which doesn't really tell you anything about the experience, but it does lend itself to descriptions of things like sausage grinders, stuffing them in one side and pushing them out the other. So the outcome of funders and institutions attempting to address a range of these issues and drivers all at the same time in their own ways has resulted in this really complex landscape. So what I want to think about here is how we view this landscape of practice, this diverse set of people and practices who all support each other in different ways. It's very chaotic. There's nothing simple to be done that's just going to change it tomorrow. But I want to challenge everybody to think about that, to think about a landscape, to think about your place in the landscape, how we share practice, how we promote better alignment and better consistency without losing the dynamism that we're in danger of strangling with too much regulation and too much confusion. And obviously, you will never create a fully collective enterprise out of doctoral education, and we don't want to. As institutions, we compete with each other. We want the funding to come here rather than to some other institution. But the ability to leverage greater resources that benefit the whole sector becomes possible when that duplication starts to come out of the system. And then finally, Kylie talks about a delicate balance between top-down and bottom-up approaches. They don't have to be mutually exclusive, but they can work together with this delicate balance. So I challenge you, could we be committed to achieving, or at least looking positively towards this balance as a sector, balancing the individual with the structural and the bureaucratic and with the community? And I'm going to stop sharing there. Thanks very much. I'm happy to circulate those slides, and my references for that material are on those slides, as is my email address. So if anybody wants to talk further, I'd be delighted to talk about this.